Assalamu alaikum and welcome to PMCC Learning Hub. I am Mr. Hussain, MEAL expert from Premier Mountain Communities Consultants, or PMCC, in Gilgit-Baltistan. Thank you for joining today's professional learning session. In this tutorial, we will discuss one of the most important foundations of credible and responsible evaluation: ethical issues in program evaluation. Understanding ethics is essential for every evaluator because the quality of an evaluation depends not only on technical skills, but also on integrity, respect for participants, and professional accountability. So let's jump right in. Here is a quick roadmap of how we're going to tackle this today. We'll start with definitions and a bit of history, move on to the famous Belmont principles, break down some key ethical guidelines, and then talk about vulnerable populations. After that, we'll dive into the tricky world of control groups and, finally, how to actually resolve the messy dilemmas we face in the field.
All right, Section 1. Let's get our definitions straight and look at exactly why these ethical guidelines exist in the first place. Now, the history here is deeply, deeply sobering. For decades, some pretty serious abuses of human subjects happened all in the name of research. The most notorious example in the US was the Tuskegee study, which kicked off back in 1932. Basically, 400 poor, illiterate black men with syphilis were told they were getting free treatment. But in reality, there was no treatment at all. Even when penicillin became widely available, researchers deliberately withheld it just so they could watch the disease progress. It's completely horrific. But that dark legacy directly sparked the 1974 National Research Act, which mandated strict federal oversight, and eventually the 1979 Belmont Report, which is literally the foundation we still rely on today. To make sure a tragedy like Tuskegee never happened again, that 1974 Act created Institutional Review Boards, or IRBs. You've probably heard of them. An IRB is basically a powerful committee of professionals and community members whose entire job is to review your research objectives, your methodology, and your protocols. Their sole focus: protecting participants from harm. Now, if you're just doing a quick internal program check for your own team, you might be exempt. But if you're planning to publish, disseminate, or share your findings publicly, well, now you've crossed into research territory, and you absolutely need to get ethical approval. Okay, moving on to Section 2. Let's talk about the foundational framework that these review boards use: the Belmont principles. So the 1979 Belmont Report is essentially the ethical North Star for all of us today. It boils down to three main pillars. First up, respect for persons. This just means protecting a person's autonomy, letting them make their own choices, and treating them with absolute courtesy. Second is beneficence. That's really just a fancy word for maximizing the good outcomes for humanity while actively minimizing any risk of harm to the people you're studying. And third, justice. This is all about ensuring fairness. Whether you're evaluating a small local education initiative or a massive climate resilience program, the costs and benefits of your research have to be distributed fairly. Every evaluation you design absolutely has to balance these three pillars. Let's translate those big ideas into our day-to-day work. Welcome to Section 3, Key Ethical Guidelines. Guideline number 1 is super straightforward but incredibly important. All participants must be volunteers, and that means getting strict, informed consent. A solid consent form clearly lays out the purpose, the exact procedures, the potential risks, even something as simple as feeling awkward about personal questions, and of course, the benefits. Most crucially, it has to explicitly state that the participant can back out at any time without any penalty whatsoever. We cannot coerce people, even accidentally. Think about it. If you're providing a service and ask a client to join an evaluation, they might say yes just because they're terrified of losing their benefits if they say no. We have to actively work to take that fear out of the equation. Another major guideline is that absolutely no harm shall result from participating in your evaluation. And listen, harm isn't just physical. As evaluators, we have to protect against psychological harm, like triggering past trauma or damaging someone's self-esteem. We also have to prevent social and economic harm. Imagine someone gives you critical feedback about a local governance program and their identity gets leaked. It could ruin their livelihood. Now, there is one major legal exception. If you're a mandated reporter, like a social worker or a teacher, and you uncover evidence of child or elder abuse, you actually have to break confidentiality to report it. But you must state that exception right up front in your consent form. Now, as meal professionals, we deal with a ton of sensitive data. And people mix these two terms up all the time: confidentiality versus anonymity. They are not the same thing. Anonymity means the identity is completely unknown to everyone, including you, the researcher. Confidentiality, on the other hand, means you know who gave you the data,
Maybe you need it to match pre- and post-test scores, but you protect their identity using secure numeric codes kept strictly under lock and key. And a quick pro tip, in small programs, even basic demographic data can act like a fingerprint. If your NGO only has one female researcher with a PhD and you list those demographics in your report, well, you just breached confidentiality without even realizing it. That brings us right into Section 4, vulnerable populations. This is where we really have to be extra vigilant. When we're working with groups at higher risk of coercion, strict oversight isn't just a good idea, it's mandatory. For minors, refugees, or marginalized communities, you can't just assume they consent. You need explicit, active, written permission from parents or guardians, plus the child's own agreement, or assent. For folks with diminished mental capacity, you have to navigate some really complex competency standards and usually bring in family guardians. And prisoners? That requires a full IRB review, complete with a dedicated prisoner representative, because history has shown us time and time again just how easily incarcerated folks can be exploited. We also have to practice culturally sensitive research. It's a delicate balance between local norms and universal ethical standards. You can't just exclude diverse communities because gaining access is hard, but you also can't ignore their cultural context. There's this fascinating example of an HIV prevention program in India that was actually led by sex workers. To evaluate it, researchers had to collaborate directly with brothel madams and pimps. Now, personally uncomfortable? Probably. Seemingly compromising? Sure. But ethically, it was absolutely necessary for the program to succeed and empower those vulnerable participants. It just goes to show that real-world ethics requires respectfully navigating local realities, not just ticking boxes in an office. All right, moving on to Section 5, control groups and complexities. Because let's face it, program evaluation is rarely black and white. We deal with a lot of gray areas, especially around deception, incentives, and control groups. First off, deception is almost never okay in our line of work. If it's absolutely 100% unavoidable, you have to do a full debriefing afterward and give participants the chance to pull their data. Secondly, incentives. You have to be super careful to avoid what we call undue inducement. A $50 gift card might be a nice little thank you for a wealthy professional, but for someone struggling with homelessness, that's so much money it could coerce them into participating or even making up data just to get paid. And finally, control groups. In social services, no treatment control groups are generally a massive ethical red flag. It is incredibly unethical to deny someone essential care just so you can have a clean baseline for your spreadsheet.
So you're probably wondering, how do we evaluate impact without denying people care? Well, one great workaround is a time series or waitlist design. Here's how it works. If an agency already has a natural waiting list, you take a baseline measurement from the folks on that list. That waitlist period acts as your control baseline. Then you measure them again right before they finally start treatment, and once more after they finish. This way, you still get rigorous comparative data, but, and this is the key part, every single client ultimately gets the help they need. Another option is simply comparing a new treatment to the standard care they'd normally receive, rather than comparing it to no care at all.
Okay, let's wrap things up with Section 6, resolving dilemmas. Because despite all these rules, the field is messy. Here is a dilemma I bet some of you have faced. Do you tell the truth about a program that is clearly failing? Or do you soften the blow? Or even obfuscate the evidence because management is breathing down your neck for positive results to secure next year's funding? It happens. Sometimes our ethical ideals crash right into workplace politics. But listen, your fundamental responsibility as an evaluator is to maintain your independence, your objectivity, and the security of your data. If you only highlight the positive quotes from staff and bury the complaints from unhappy clients just to keep the boss happy, your evaluation is completely invalid. And honestly, it's unethical.
When you inevitably hit one of these ethical walls, don't panic. Here is your step-by-step playbook. Step 1. Take a breath, examine your options, and write down exactly what the problem is. Step 2. Hit the literature. See how other professionals have handled this exact same thing. Step 3. Check your professional ethics codes, like the American Evaluation Association guidelines. Step 4. Talk to someone. Discuss it with respected peers or reach out to an IRB for an outside perspective. And Step 5. Have an honest conversation with your supervisor to deliberate and make a final call. Navigating these tough spots with your integrity intact is exactly what makes you a true meal professional.
Thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope today's session has helped you better understand the ethical responsibilities that every evaluator must uphold. Ethical evaluation is not simply about following procedures, it is about protecting people, maintaining professional integrity, and producing evidence that decision-makers can trust. I am Mr. Hussain, meal expert from Premier Mountain Communities Consultants PMCC Gilgit-Baltistan. Stay committed to learning, continue strengthening your evaluation skills, and I look forward to meeting you in our next professional tutorial. Until then, Allah Hafiz. If you found this tutorial useful, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue producing high-quality learning content on monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning, meal, program management, and development practice. Before we completely sign off, I'll leave you with one final question to think about. Does your evaluation practice truly prioritize protecting human dignity, or are you just ticking procedural checkboxes? Think about it.